All right. Hello. So my name is Alberto Sonnino. I'm a researcher at UCL and also a research scientist at Facebook. So this is work, so I should first start by saying whatever I say today is my personal opinion. I'm here under UCL, so I'm as a UCL researcher. This has absolutely nothing to do with Facebook, so don't misunderstand whatever I say for their opinion, right? So that said, so I'm going to present you Coconut threshold issuance selective disclosure credentials with application to distributed ledgers. So these talks, I understand that falls nice in the category right after the last meetup that you guys had, where you had a few presentations about zero-knowledge proof systems. Mari was presenting, Merlin, if I remember correctly, something like that. And so this is basically one of the applications, on the main application that you can have of zero-knowledge proof system. And it's building credentials. All right. So it's a very long title, and the reason why the title was so long is more because this work was done as part of a startup that I had before, and it was useful to impress investors and get the paper accepted. But it's actually not that complicated. What it tells, in a few words, is we're building privacy-preserving credentials. So you're probably all familiar with that since zero-knowledge meetup. So what we do is imagine that you would like to have some credentials. We can take the example of identity, as it's one of the biggest examples with credentials. That says, look, you have an identity card or you have a passport, and you go to a bar. Sure, you can show it to them in order to allow you in, because you should be older than 18 to be able to drink. Fine, but if you do that, you will reveal your age. The bartender will certainly know you're over 18, but then you reveal your name, your address, and a lot of private information about you. So privacy preserving here would say, look, you may have a way to, on the one hand, doing selective disclosure. Let's say you just reveal the age, but you don't want to reveal the name, the address, and all those things. And on the other hand, you may even say, let's go even further, and you don't even reveal the age. You just prove in zero knowledge that you're over 18. The bartender doesn't need to know your age. He just needs that information to serve you your drinks, right? And so privacy-preserving credentials, anonymous credentials, selective disclosure credentials, it's all about the same thing, at least for this talk. And I've been existing from the 90s. Right? CL signatures were there, then all up to PS signatures 3 years ago, I believe. So on that sense, it's a very well-known primitive. And the difference here is we're trying to have it without a single issuer. That's where the threshold issues. So now the question would be, why going through all that trouble to do something that existed long before that, just to have threshold issuance? What's the advantage of that? And so there is one big motivation, which is blockchains, as most of the time. So we want to operate in the blockchain context with all of that. And so I may give a little bit of history around that. I mean, probably most of you know, but it's always interesting to go back on where those things were at the time and how they moved so fast here. So it's a very simple principle. You have a user, you have a machine, and that user, what he wants to do is to submit a transaction, which is a series of commands, let's say, that would go to the machines, get executed on the machines, come back ordered and executed. Fine, that's one machines, and 40 years ago, distributed system researcher was saying, look, let's try to have a bit more resilience. What if the machine is down? Can we have multiple machines that would do the same thing, right? And so we have that setting, right? You have the users that builds the transactions, submits it in some way to the set of machines that would run a potentially complicated protocol between themselves, but at the end of the day, what should happen is that they output the executed transactions and a list of transactions as output there, exactly as before. And so the advantage of that is we say, look, now if we have a subset of those machines down or corrupt or malicious that try to actively make the other people fail, this shouldn't matter and the system should still go on with that. And finally, they should happen in such a way that it's completely transparent to the user. It could use that system, it's a distributed system, but the output should be all the same. And so those have been studying for a very long time as well. initially for space applications where we were sending things to space, and then, I mean, you don't really want them to fail because of whatever reasons, and then having the whole spacecraft out of satellite. And then building all of those, people were saying, look, it's nice, you have Byzantine failure, traditional system of no failure, sure, but on the other hand, they're hard to build, they're expensive, conventional systems are easier, so you know what, Byzantine systems were not that used for all this time. And this happens for a very long time. And no one really cares about that in some ways. And one day someone said, well, wait a second, we can actually build money out of it. And from that day, it became basically a street fight. You have VC, bankers, regulators, startups, everybody's in the game and working inside those things. And crypto conferences have been very influenced by that as well. They used to look more like this, and now cryptographers are like more rock star. I mean, everybody looks at what they do every time there is a conference. Everybody's out there, right? And so that's basically the motivations behind the work. We want to follow the traditions of blockchains. This joint work with all these people, Mustafa, Bano, Sarah, and George. All right, so why is it hard to work in the blockchain space with those privacy technologies? So in the general scenario, again, we may have now smart contracts, more generic than a transaction, let's say. You submit it to the blockchain, and the difficulty comes from the fact that everybody needs to be able to verify the correct execution of that transaction. So in the clear text, sure, you can submit your codes, it's executed, ordered, everybody can see. But if you do that, can we issue credentials in a distributed way, knowing that they may involve secrets, and still everybody needs to be able to verify them? So what we really would like to do is we write one contract. These smart contracts would take some attributes and goes to the blockchains, gets executed, and at the end of the day, you get some credentials. So still verified by everybody, but only you should be able to take those credentials, use them with another smart contract to authenticate yourself or for whatever other reasons. Despite that, the issuance and the verification may happen entirely on-chain and under the eye of everybody. So yeah, it's more like the traditional setting. That's not really a problem, or the traditional selective disclosure credentials, where you may have to write one program to the server, and at the end of the day, no one can actually see them. You just have the selective access directly mediated through the central parties. But as I said, this is not exactly the setting we're working on, because we really care deeply about Byzantine resistance, crash failure, chance of super resistance, and all the distributions around the world. So there are actually two key problems where it comes to distributing credentials on blockchains. So the first is, sure, while the transaction is recorded on chain, which is not exactly easy, but then your attributes should be kept secret, at least some parts of them, and the signing key of the credentials should also be kept secret. Though this seems totally obvious, but it means that you cannot have a smart contract that just signs credentials for people in some ways. And then once you got those credentials, so first only you should be able to use them, but you should also be able to go and be anonymous while reusing them on the blockchain, despite everybody could potentially have observed the issuing process on chain. So yeah, the properties that we need. Blindness is the first. So what does it mean? It means that I go, let's take the example of identity cards. I want to get the passport issues. Well, potentially some of the fields there should be kept secret with respect to the signer itself. Potentially it may involve some random nonce that only I, the user, should actually know. So we should be able to issue those credentials over blinded attributes. The second one is unlinkability. So this means that I have my credentials and I can go multiple times and use them in various places. So I can go twice to the same bar, show him twice the same credentials, and yet he should not be able to tell that I'm twice the same person that came. And this should be unlinkable across usages, but also across issuance and usage of the credentials. And threshold authority, that's kind of the new one. We don't want a single issuer to issue the credentials, but somehow a joint set of people working kind of together to get the credentials to the user. But we want that without asking the authorities to interact. Because at the end of the day, what we would potentially do is to say, look, we have some nodes on the blockchain, and what we would do, well, if it's a permissionless setting, it's easier, but if it's a sharded system, it may work as well. We say every node is actually one of the authorities, and as part of the smart contract, they would issue that credentials, but we don't want to have the overhead in addition to consensus just to issue some credentials when it comes to. And the last one is efficient, specifically in verification, since we want those credentials to be verified by the smart contract. And that's basically the story of why we built Coconut. Is the one that fulfills all the purposes of before. So as I said, feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions, like during the presentation. Don't wait until the end. So yeah, those are related works, basically nothing that I didn't said until now. So yeah, what is it exactly? It basically brings two contributions. The first is the cryptographic scheme, and the second one is we designed the system in such a way that it can be implemented as a library on a smart contract, and then all other smart contracts written by potentially other person would be able to have a variety of applications just by making functions call to that library. So all the crypto logic and, let's say, the more delicate things that you don't want to get it wrong should be written once by the library and then just reused every time by other people. So this is a bit of the content. So the overview, we'll just go through the scheme, the library, and then show you some applications which were not really possible before having the threshold issuance, and then some performance and numbers that we get from that. So at the very high level, how does it work? You have a user here, and you have a set of authorities. What you do is the first step. The user would go somehow through the blockchain, potentially directly, and ask the authorities for some credentials. The authorities issue the credentials, and then the user aggregates all the pieces of credentials that he got from the authority into one big credentials. Yes?
So the thing that I wasn't clear on is there blindness in the request and issue of the credentials?
Could be. So some of the attributes, you may want them blind. Some of them, you may not want them blind. And this strictly depends on the applications. After that, I will go through some applications, and I can show you exactly which of these attributes need to be blinded and which one, at the end of the day, you don't care. For instance, one may say expiration dates, if they're generic enough, you may keep them in public. Right? Not all attributes need to be blinded at all time, basically. And yeah, so you aggregate your credentials, and you randomize, and you can show them. It's a bit misleading because you should randomize the credentials every time you show them, not just once. But basically, that's the high-level process. So, as I said, we have our authorities, and we only require a subset of them to be honest and to actually issue the credentials. So the other might be dead, might be down, or might be actively malicious, or doing any kind of censorship against the user. And so we only need to collect T shares of credentials in order to aggregate them to a single credential. And that's the reason why it maps well with blockchains. Let's say that we have a shard in a sharded system, and then we can have a subset of the network being some authorities for some specific applications. And we would simply say, well, look, 2f plus 1, which is the Byzantine threshold, will actually be the T of the number of honest shares that you need. And this actually works well in that setting. So the cryptographic scheme, those are the high-level functions. As I said, so yeah?
Sorry, can you explain what F is in terms of N?
Oh, sorry, yeah. So basically F is the number of faulty nodes that you generally tolerate in the consensus protocol, right? Yeah, sorry, I assumed it was, but yeah. Yeah, it doesn't make much sense otherwise. I agree, sorry for that. So yeah, the cryptographic primitive. So as I said, all of them, if not all of them, but most of them will actually make use of a zero knowledge proof system. Those can be implemented, actually we did implement it using standard Sigma protocols, the easiest you can imagine. But they're simple, they're very fast for some of the things they need to do, but I mean, they have caveats like they scale badly for verification if you have a lot of attributes. So you may actually take any zero knowledge proof systems, snarks on one of the new one, and just plug them there, and have the same issuance of credential, the same threshold scheme by using that zero knowledge proof system and make it different, right? So that means that setup is either a trusted setup, if you're using snarks, or if you're using Sigma protocols and you rely on random oracle, well, you don't need trusted setup in that scenario. Keygen is just something run by each authorities to generate the key. And it's a bit tricky there as well, because you need a threshold key distribution protocol without a central party, right? So some of these protocol exists, and the easiest one requires synchrony. Some harder one piggyback on consensus in order to work over partial synchrony as well. But this is complicated, but it happens only once. So the authority is set up, they generate the threshold keys, and then they can issue many credentials with those keys. But I'll come back to that. An aggregation key, so once you set up your smart contracts or you're the verifier, what you do is you aggregate the shares of public keys of all the authorities into one big aggregated key. Okay, so initialization should happen once, or let's say at least rarely. And then what you have is the issuance, well, blind issuance we can say in that case, which is just the process on which the user goes, gets the credentials, aggregates them, and puts them all at once. And verify is prove credentials where the user prove knowledge of the credentials, so selectively disclose some subset of the attributes, and verify credentials that we generally put on the smart contracts to verify the proof credentials there. So at the heart, Coconut is a mix of PS signature and BLS signatures. What it does is it relies on the structures of PS signatures, and it makes it deterministic over multiple authorities, since we don't want those authorities to communicate with each other, to use the BLS trick of hash to point. So I generally tend to have no math on the slides. I've been told that is not how you get popular, but I just put those one. Basically, this is a very, very quick view on how it works. If you have an attribute M, you compute a commitment to M, and then you can hash to points a la BLS. You get that little h here, and to get the signature, so the credential itself, you can do it in that way. So it's the h, and then it's h to the x plus my, where X and Y are actually the keys of the authorities. So, yeah?
What is CM there?
So CM is a commitment. So what you do is you commit to M and then you hash the commitment, right? And so this is the structure here comes from what are signatures back then. It's not the way to put all together is the novelty here, basically. Yeah?
What becomes the public key of this key?
Yeah, so I didn't put it on the slide because I tried to not put math, right? But basically what you have is G2, because it uses pairings to the X, and G2 to the Y, right? And the signature lives in G1, but that's exactly what I wanted to abstract during the presentation. So let's say that if you have a detailed question there, so I have a backup slide that tells you all about the crypto, but we will go there only if you are interested, because chances are that you're absolutely not on a Friday night. So the communication protocol is not very complicated. You would have the user that, to get its credentials, generate some cryptographic elements lambda, and potentially predicates that the attribute inside lambda satisfy, send them to the authority I. Authority I send back a piece of blinded credential. This is repeated at least t time. Basically, you need to hit t honest authorities. Once you do that, you're good, you aggregate, and to show it, you just compute another cryptographic element that proves that the attribute embedded there satisfy whatever predicate phi prime. And you can send them to a verifier. So this is basically the communications that you would say and the communication complexity of the product. Okay, and this is the smart contract library. So it's a big figure. I should have put it like in two pieces, but what we do is we have on the smart contracts 4 functions: create, request, issue, and verify. And then I'll go through the application and I will show you we basically just make calls to those specific functions, and we can do all sorts of applications. So how it goes here is that you have some authorities. We abstract by saying the authorities are outside the ledger now, but they could actually be the nodes of the ledger themselves. It doesn't make any difference. What they do is they run that key generation some way, and they would put some information on the creates on the ledger through the create functions. This information would be the public key. Ideally, they're aggregated public key. N, the number of authority. T, the thresholds. Again, if you map them to the node, it makes sense to take 12 plus 1. The user will read them, fine. To request credentials, it would send its attributes or blinded attributes to the smart contracts. The authorities would read them through the smart contract, or if they are themselves holding the ledger, well, they may have facilities to get them directly in the pipeline. Gets the attribute and put back on the smart contracts pieces of credentials. So everybody would put a share there. The users sees the shares, reads them, and aggregates them. That would be step 6. So now it's important to have at least one blinded attribute there. Because if you don't, it means that whoever can observe step 3, 4, 5, 6 is actually as good as the user to reuse the credentials in his behalf. However, if attributes here add some blinded value, the credential can only be used by generating a proof of knowledge of all the attributes. And so that's how you make sure that only the legitimate user can use the credentials that are actually issued publicly through the chain. So these are some advantages. Yeah.
So you said that authorities don't have to be on a ledger.
Yeah.
How are they known to be authorities?
So basically, this also depends on the applications. But generally speaking, you may have a group of people that may even not be the nodes of the ledger, that create an instance of the smart contract and put some information on creates. I'll go through one application where that is particularly useful, and then as a user, you may say, well, I kind of trust these authorities, I trust T out of N of those authorities, so credentials that these guys would issue me are meaningful to me and to another smart contract, the application-dependent smart contract that I would go right after that.
The authorities themselves have known verifiable credentials, whether or not they're live, they are incorporated into a contract with.
Absolutely, right? In the general case, you don't assume anything. Now, for some other application, you can compose these with other calls, right? For instance, to say, look, I'm an authority, and by the way, this is my domain name, and I may have some proofs or whatever, right? You may have even signature, because at the end of the day, authorities are not meant to be kept secrets. So this really depends on the application. After that, I will go through one of the petition applications when I will show you it's actually natural to work in that way. It's basically very application dependent. So that's the answer. But come back to me in 2 slides if you're not satisfied with the answer. Yeah. And so the latter one is the facility to verify the credentials. So another smart contract could just call verify, pass the credentials, and get a yes or no based on that. So now that we have that, I will go through 2 example applications, and maybe it will clarify a little bit what needs to be blinded, what it's absolutely not needed to be blinded, and who are those authorities, depending on how you handle that. And actually, the big question is, who needs to trust those authorities, right? Is it the user, or is it someone else, or is it both, right? So the first application that you can build, so we built a coin tumbler, and it's actually on very few lines of code, assuming that you can make calls to that smart contract library, right? And it becomes very easy at that point. So the way it works is we assume that we have, so some authority comes, go together, call the create, and now whoever user trusts the integrity of those authorities would go and operate under that tumbler. Note that nothing prevents another set of authorities by reusing the same library and says, look, I'm super different than those guys, maybe other person would trust me more, and I would do the exact same thing. And as a user, you would just go to the smart contract instance of the authority that you would trust more, or none if you don't trust any of them. So this is an example where it may be interesting to just have the authorities being the node of the ledger, because if they're corrupt, if more than T are corrupt, you have no ledger anyway. So I mean, you have bigger problems at that point. So how does it work? You put some coins on the contracts that goes to, let's say, a buffer account, and after that, the authority issue you a token. You can take that token. It's a credential, so you can randomize it. And so that token is issued, so in our implementation, if I remember correctly, over 2 attributes. The first is a random nonce. Then you have the value, if you want to keep it clear. We kept it clear, but there are ways to just hide the value as well. And we can also add a third one, actually, which is an expiration date. So we may say the expiration dates, if it's fairly generic, if we say we operate by time slots and we have enough users to have a big anonymity set, doesn't need to be blinded. So this is an example attribute that doesn't need to be blinded. However, the secret nonce need to be blinded absolutely, because if you don't do that, anybody, the authority themselves, or actually any of the authorities, you know that there are at least one corrupt in the threat model, can go and steal your coin. So in that scenario here, if you do that, it means that the authorities, if they're corrupt, they can steal your coin, so it makes sense to put them as node on the ledger, but they cannot break privacy. Because since you randomize the credentials, you don't rely on trapdoor for that, at least in most schemes, and not in the Sigma protocols that we use for the implementation. So we're step 4. You got that token, you randomized it, and you can give it to a merchant as a payment, or you can be yourself your own merchant if you want, and you can submit it to the withdraw smart contracts that just does a simple thing. It makes a call to the verify function by passing the token, and if that function returns true, well, then you just take some money out of the buffer and you can return it to the account specified by the merchant or the user itself. So that's one. And the other one is the privacy-preserving petition. It's actually one of the reason why we created that scheme, because they wanted to do some of these, implement some of this idea in Barcelona at the time. And so this is an example where we say, look, we have several regions in one country, and each region could actually act as an authority. And then we would work on any blockchain that we trust being correct, right? So what you do is a citizen would go either electronically or personally, depending on personally with multiple authorities, it's a problem, but electronically to give some kinds of ID, doing some KYC, whatnot, and get back some credential from the authorities. So this could be like a digital passport. And you do it once, or not often at least, right? So you got those credentials and you keep it in the long run. Now, whoever, a petition creator, a totally different person that has nothing to do with all the system, goes on the smart contract that says, look, I'm creating here a petition. I point to those particular set of authority by saying, whoever has a credential issued by those guys can actually vote on my petition. This through the smart contract. So if you have the regions of the country issuing them, well, then it makes sense. You kind of hope that you would have one vote, at most one vote per person. But you may do it different setting by saying this is a closed group for the petitions. So you create that petitions, the user would simply randomize his credentials, go and vote on the blockchain. It means that no one could actually know, not even the authority, that which citizen voted for what. But interestingly, it also means that once you got those credentials, you can reuse the same across multiple campaigns. So if another guy comes and says, look, here's another petitions, again, by whoever has the credential from those set of authority can go ahead, well, you can reuse those credentials and still keep unlinkability. So yeah, so what we put open source is the cryptographic library that does that. And the benchmark, if we use, yeah?
Sorry, just going back to the previous slide.
Yes, sure.
Aren't you afraid that out of 4, we actually leak who's doing the smart contract code because you don't make the guess depending on the platform you're in? So aren't you worried about the metadata leakage for our 4?
Oh, metadata. I mean, if you here we assume that yeah, if you're saying network attacks, we check your IP address and all these things. Oh, sure, this is an application protocol, right? If someone can trace you and like look at whatever you do, or look after over your shoulder 24 hours a day, there is nothing you can do better, right? But it's a different set of problems there.
Yeah, but even at the
Yeah.
then you still have leakages at the application layer just
Mhm.
by looking at the chain. And of course, then you need to worry about what's on the wire in the actual message.
So all these applications, so it's true, all these applications over privacy work with the concept of anonymity set. And you basically, so to explain it, so the best way to explain it is, if you have no anonymity set, which is, let's say, only me, I build that system, let's say, I have my family being the authorities, and I get my credentials, and I'm the only one doing that, and then I go and I use it on chain. If people know that I'm the only one using it, well, it's dead, right? Whatever I do, people would know it's only me. If it's two of us, you and me, well, they have one chance over two. So all of these applications assume that you have, potentially per particular time slot, enough traffic to hide them, to hide which is which.
Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
we can take this offline.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, sure. Right. Yeah, so the cryptographic library. Another question?
Yeah, again on the petition.
Yeah.
Double vote prevention.
Which one?
Because you said it's like a randomized identity sound every time you use it, right?
Right, yes.
Is there a double vote prevention, so I can't vote twice in the same?
That's a very nice question, actually. Yes, so you can prevent or limit the number of times that people vote. You use actually, it's a very simple trick, but it's true that I should have mentioned. So the way you prevent that is you have one secret attribute, blinded issued attribute in the credentials. And what you do is you also submit, along with the credential, one group element that is uniquely derived from, let's say, the petition ID or like the states of the time of the smart contracts being created, something unique. So you hash 2 points and you raise that point to your secrets. If you do that, you will not be able to produce with the same set of credentials twice such group elements. Oh, I mean, it will be twice the same. And you can use that here in the contract by saying, you always have to prove me correctness of that point. If I see it once, I put it in a spent list. If you tell it twice to me, either I reject it or I keep it, but I know that you voted twice. But it's absolutely good questions. And again, their whole question is, how do you keep that list? Do you want to put it on the smart contract? Maybe not. Maybe you want to put it off chain, and then it's up to the user to prove non-inclusion of that elliptic curve points into cryptographic accumulators. What we did as implementation is we just brutally put in those smart contract. That's potentially not how you want to implement them. But that's a very good question. Absolutely. A question there, or is it just like a hot room? No. Okay. So yeah, we built a smart contract library for Ethereum and chain space, and those applications, the coin tumbler, the e-petition, and we also add another one, which is the censorship resistant distribution of proxy that leverage those credentials to prevent censorship at the level of the proxy, basically. And yeah, it's on GitHub and open source if you're ever interested in that. It's written in Python. So about the speed of those things, the blind sign, so the operation done by the authorities, is fairly fast. I mean, it's 3 milliseconds. This is run on my laptop, and it's not that one. It was like a crappy laptop at the time. So it's a commodity machine. Potentially a server could go much faster than that, like 5 times faster without too many troubles. And the verifications, verifying the credentials, takes 10 milliseconds on that machine. So 10 milliseconds, we were happy with that because it means that it's actually reasonable for smart contracts to operate over those. And yeah, so the size of the credentials is 2 group elements, and it does not increase, so it says constant size, no matter the number of attributes you put in, and no matter the number of authorities that you have. If you see the construction, it all makes sense, but it's a nice property to have. However, that said, when you prove knowledge of your credentials, you incur the cost of your zero knowledge proof system. So if you have proofs that are constant size, then sure, I mean, you benefit from constant size attribute, constant size authorities as a whole. But if you use Sigma protocol as our prototype implementation, then proving the zero knowledge proof part is linear in the number of attributes. But the credentials themselves are just 2 group elements, whatever you do. And the communication complexity, So to request your credentials, it's a ON, N being the number of authorities. And there is little you can do about that, at least I can imagine for now, is because you need to go to each authorities and get a credentials, or at least T of them, but T is still linear in N. And verification is O1. You can give it to a smart contract, everything is aggregated. Let's say that if the smart contract already includes the aggregated key, this is how the library works. It gets your aggregated credentials and it verifies at once, no matter the number of authorities that you have. And that's it. Yeah, we tried to evaluate it in AWS to see what happens if we really try to put like authority all around the world and see the latency that we get as a user in order to get those credentials. Because again, if it like takes hours, I mean, that's probably less useful for a coin tumbler than if it takes seconds. But it was fairly good. So this is how it behaves. It stays under the seconds. If we go to the authorities up to 10. And I checked a little bit more, and it happens that this is not really crypto. This is probably more network delay, in the sense that those authorities are the ones that are very close to the client. And if you go like to Tokyo and Sydney, that's the very last. So you incur the network delay, but the crypto doesn't really impact those mechanisms. So that's it. The rest of the paper have the full scheme, like the smart contract evaluations, the details of the attributes for all the applications, which are blended, which are not blinded, the trust model that you have there. So who needs to trust the authorities in which applications, because they're actually application dependent. And yeah, a full benchmark of all what I said. And so we have some limitations. So if you have answers, that would be nice to come and talk to me, potentially offline, because that may take a lot of time. The thing is, for the key generation, so it's okay if we don't run it too often, because it's a potentially interactive process, unless if you piggyback on a smart contract to run the key generation process. Adding authority is not too hard. We can rely on some proactive secret sharing and just add more. But I don't see a way to remove authorities without having to rerun the key generations. So that said, I've seen 4 days ago a paper that claims to do about that, SHRP, something like that. So I might be outdated of a few days. And the second limitations, what is it? Yeah, they're complex to implement, and since we already have a blockchain, can we actually leverage the fact that we already have the total ordering in order to get those key generation faster, rather than using the classic Gennaro key distribution protocol and then using whatever consensus mechanism we want to get it work in partial synchrony. So I know that Dfinity is doing some work on that, but I don't know the state of the art. And well, as the next step, sure, now if you can have blockchains that operate on nodes' secrets by issuing the credentials, I was wondering maybe what we could do is have something a bit more general. Instead of having smart contract where the user submits his transaction, his code to execute, and the zero knowledge proof gets checked on the smart contract, can we also have the authorities or the nodes themselves operates on secret value that they have? Right now, the smart contract only execute code that is public to everybody. If we could have a more general framework where the authority could actually inject functions of their secret, that could be very nice. For instance, threshold decryptions. Then only if it gets order, you get decryptions. But it's actually more tricky than one may think. And yeah, on the conclusion, that was Coconut, the credential scheme, the smart contract library. I think I'm a bit over time, so try to be faster. And the main takeaway here are threshold issuance are basically the thing that makes it nice and compatible with blockchains, and the fact that you can re-randomize the credentials is what allows you to use them multiple times without incurring, let's say, the key generation or the issuance cost too often at least. And that's it. So thank you for your attention.